Welcome to another deep dive episode of Inside American Politics. I'm your host, Bradley Teller. Today we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most pervasive yet misunderstood systems of power in modern history. And as always with Scoob's investigations, we're not stopping at the surface. This isn't just about hooded figures or torchlit marches. We're digging into what Charles W. Mills called the unnamed political system that has shaped the modern world. If you ever want to explore these deeper political threads, the extended series is always available on the Scoob app. Link in the description. Over the next hour, we'll journey from 15th century papal decrees to 21st century internet forums, from colonial conquest to modern political campaigns. We'll explore how a system born in the age of sailing ships has evolved into a global network of power that operates largely unseen, shaping everything from international relations to individual psychology. Let's start where it all began, not with hatred, but with holy war. Picture this. It's the 1400s. European explorers are setting sail across uncharted waters, claiming entire continents in the name of God and country. But here's what your history textbook probably didn't tell you. They weren't just guided by courage and curiosity. They were armed with a papal decree that would justify centuries of violence and exploitation. The Christian Doctrine of Discovery declared that the entire world fell under the jurisdiction of the Pope, God's representative on earth. Any land not ruled by a Christian sovereign could be claimed for God. This wasn't just religious doctrine. It was the world's first international legal framework for what we now recognize as genocide. Think about the audacity of that claim. European powers literally drew up divine permission slips to steal continents, enslave populations, and erase entire civilizations. They sailed the globe taking land, resources, and human lives, all while asserting their actions were sanctioned by the Almighty Himself. This wasn't random violence, it was systematic. Academics distinguish between two forms of colonization, and understanding both is crucial to seeing how this system operated. External colonization focused on extraction, tea from India, sugar from the Caribbean, human labor from Africa, silk from China. The goal was simple: drain the wealth of colonized territories to enrich the European homeland. But then there was internal colonization, the more insidious cousin. This was about controlling minds and souls through schooling that erased local knowledge, policing that criminalized traditional practices, segregation that divided communities, surveillance that monitored resistance, and systematic divestment that ensured colonized peoples could never accumulate power. The colonizers' playbook was elegantly brutal: divide, control, and exploit. At its height in the early 1920s, the British Empire alone governed nearly a fifth of the world's population and controlled a quarter of its land. But here's the kicker. When pollsters surveyed British citizens in 2014, 59% still felt colonial activities were a source of pride. Let that sink in. In 2014, when we supposedly know better, British citizens were 3 times more likely to feel proud of colonization than ashamed of it. Half of those polled claimed that countries colonized by Britain were better off for it. That's white supremacy alive and well in the 21st century, folks. Not as a historical curiosity, but as a living, breathing worldview that continues to shape how entire populations understand their place in the world. But here's where the American story gets uniquely twisted. In most places, colonizers eventually left, either driven out by independence movements or simply because the extraction was complete. In America, they stayed. This is what scholars call settler colonialism, and it creates a special kind of permanent trauma. Manifest destiny, that rallying cry for westward expansion, was essentially the Doctrine of Discovery updated for the 19th century and dressed up in the language of American exceptionalism. To claim land that didn't belong to them, settlers had to do more than conquer. They had to erase. They rewrote history to legitimize their actions, transformed genocide into progress, and convinced themselves they had a divine right to the land. This is crucial to understand. Settlers cannot be considered immigrants. Immigrants are expected to obey the laws of the land. Settlers create new laws in their own image. Tunisian author Albert Memmi captured the psychological complexity of this system when he wrote, It is not easy to escape mentally from a concrete situation, to refuse its ideology while continuing to live with its actual relationships. In America, white settlers compounded this trauma by bringing enslaved people and attracting low-wage workers, many people of color, who were exploited by the settler system, yet also seen as settlers from the indigenous perspective. The systematic destruction was breathtaking in its scope. Settler colonialism brought death, disease, diaspora, and cultural subjugation to Native communities. It didn't just suppress Native governance and sovereignty, it delegitimized entire ways of knowing and being in the world. Forced removals severed communities from lands that weren't just economically important, they were essential to physical, mental, cultural, and spiritual survival. These were lands that contained not just the plants and animals needed for sustenance, but the bones of ancestors, the sites of sacred ceremonies, the geographical markers of cultural identity itself. And when physical separation failed to extinguish Native communities, settlers initiated the era of boarding schools. Children were separated from families and cultures, their hair cut, their languages forbidden, their spirits systematically broken as they were forced to adopt European ways: divide, control, exploit. The pattern was consistent, even as the methods evolved. Now here's where this story gets really interesting, and really dangerous. White supremacy's greatest power isn't in its visibility, but in its invisibility. When most people hear white supremacy, they think of the images from the civil rights era: angry mobs beating black protesters at lunch counters, bombs exploding in churches, grown adults screaming at 6-year-old Ruby Bridges as she walked to school. Today, they might think of the alt-right marchers in Charlottesville, carrying torches and chanting "blood and soil." But here's what sociologists understand that most people miss. White supremacy is not primarily about individual white people and their personal intentions or actions. It's an overarching political, economic, and social system of domination. Racism is a structure, not an event. Charles W. Mills laid this out brilliantly in The Racial Contract. He argues that white supremacy is a tacit and sometimes explicit agreement among peoples of European descent to assert, promote, and maintain the ideal of white superiority in relation to all other people of the world. This agreement doesn't require conscious conspiracy. It's built into the very foundations of our social contracts. White supremacy has shaped a system of global European domination that brings into existence whites and non-whites, full persons and subpersons. It influences moral theory and psychology and is imposed on non-whites through both ideological conditioning and violence. Mills makes a devastating observation. What has usually been taken as the racist exception has really been the rule. What has been taken as the rule, racial equality, has really been the exception. Think about that. For hundreds of years, white supremacy has been the default setting of Western civilization, but it's never named as such. We study socialism, capitalism, fascism as political systems, but white supremacy, which Mills calls the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today, operates in the shadows. And this invisibility is not accidental. Much of white supremacy's power is drawn from its taken-for-granted nature, the assumptions that underwrite all other political and social contracts without ever being acknowledged or examined. This is particularly relevant today because the United States is a global power. Through movies and mass media, corporate culture, advertising, U.S.-owned manufacturing, military presence, historical colonial relations, missionary work, and countless other channels, American white supremacy is circulated globally. This powerful ideology promotes the idea of whiteness as the ideal for humanity well beyond the West, especially in countries with histories of Western colonialism. Fast forward to the 21st century, and we see white supremacy undergoing perhaps its most dramatic evolution yet. It's gone digital, global, and sophisticated in ways that would have been impossible just a generation ago. White supremacy is no longer confined to the shadows. It has evolved, taking on new forms that are harder to recognize but no less dangerous. The movement has found fertile ground in our digitally connected world, where extremists can spread their messages across continents in an instant. Barbara Perry, director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, puts it perfectly. White supremacy now has a subtler look. These extremists are no longer wearing the white robes of the Klan or the black leather jackets of skinheads. Many are white-collar workers, well-educated, and sophisticated in their use of technology, language, and narrative construction. The movement has changed its face, but not its fundamental nature. The numbers are staggering. In the U.S., public white supremacist events increased by 123% between 2016 and 2018. By 2018, the number of known hate groups reached its highest level in 2 decades, fueled by political polarization, anti-immigrant sentiment, and social media platforms that spread propaganda at unprecedented speed and scale. What's different now is that people feel more empowered to express these beliefs openly. They perceive them as normalized by political events, the Trump election in the U.S., the rise of nationalism across Europe and Brazil, and other global shifts that make explicit white supremacist rhetoric seem more socially acceptable. And sometimes this digital radicalization has deadly real-world consequences. On March 15, 2019, a gunman murdered 50 worshippers and critically wounded 9 others at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. The guns used in the attack were decorated with the names of violent white supremacists, a horrifying demonstration of how online communities of hate can inspire individual acts of terror. These attackers weren't isolated actors. They operated individually but were shaped by a greater collective of which they were part, connected through digital networks that span the globe. The story of Elsa, let's call her that, illustrates how modern recruitment works. A former white supremacist who helped shut down Canada's Heritage Front in the 1990s, she immigrated from communist Romania as a young girl. After her father died and her mother became abusive, she ended up in foster care. I was 16, had dropped out of high school, and felt angry and alone, she recalls. I didn't have a sense of belonging and didn't know who I was. One day, I saw a clean-cut man in a suit on television talking about the importance of being proud of your European heritage. Within months, she became the face of the organization, a clean-cut, innocent-looking European girl, groomed to be the perfect spokesperson. She was taught how to recruit others using a simple but ruthless strategy: find a person's deepest fear and let it fester. Whether it was losing a scholarship to an Asian student or romantic rejection in favor of a black partner, she was instructed to identify the fear and exploit it. The message was always the same: hate is self-preservation. The advent of the internet has made this recruitment process exponentially more powerful. A recruiter can now reach someone thousands of miles away, and messages propagate faster than anything we've seen before. They target individuals with low self-esteem, those who feel isolated or without belonging, and in our increasingly disconnected world, there's no shortage of such targets. Which brings us to the most recent chapter of this story: the mainstreaming of white supremacist rhetoric in American politics. The 2016 to 2020 period represents perhaps the most significant normalization of explicit white supremacist language and symbolism in mainstream American politics since the Civil Rights era. Throughout this period, we witnessed an unprecedented pattern of political rhetoric that consistently defended, amplified, and normalized white supremacist positions. Black Lives Matter protesters were frequently dismissed as anarchists, agitators, and looters, while the movement itself was labeled as representing hate. In May 2020, we saw the resurrection of explicitly racist police language when President Trump tweeted the phrase associated with Miami Police Chief Walter Headley from 1967. "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." Confederate monuments and the Confederate flag were defended as beautiful symbols of our heritage, while proposals to rename military bases honoring Confederate generals were rejected. Perhaps most telling were the retweets of videos showing supporters shouting "White Power" and attacking Black Lives Matter protesters with paintballs and pepper spray. When 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse killed 2 protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin, there was no condemnation, only silence that spoke volumes. During the first presidential debate in September 2020, When directly asked to condemn white supremacists, Trump initially prevaricated. Even when prompted by both his opponent and the debate moderator to explicitly denounce the Proud Boys, he refused, instead telling the group to stand back and stand by. This wasn't just political theater. It was a signal to movements that had spent decades trying to gain mainstream acceptance. For years, white supremacist groups had been rebranding themselves, first as white nationalists, then as the alt-right, always seeking greater social respectability. During the Democratic primaries, some politicians explicitly called this what it was: white supremacy in action. The eventual Democratic nominee stopped short of that label, but accused Trump of fanning the flames of white supremacy, calling him America's first racist president, and noting, "The way he deals with people based on the color of their skin, their national origin, where they're from, is absolutely sickening." Trump ultimately lost the 2020 election by over 7 million popular votes and 74 electoral college votes, but the forces and attitudes that were unleashed and sustained during that era didn't vanish with a new presidency. White supremacists have spent the past 2 decades advancing and normalizing their agenda, bolstered by 2 key factors: demographic shifts and technological evolution. The projected decline in the proportion of Americans identifying as white by 2050 has created what scholars call racial threat among some white populations, while the rise of the internet has provided unprecedented opportunities for recruitment and ideological dissemination. George Hawley estimates that roughly 6% of Americans identify with or are sympathetic to the white nationalist cause, about 11 million people out of a total white population of 200 million. While many groups remain small or exist primarily online, the potential for growth is substantial. Today's radical right includes several groups that embrace some form of white supremacy. Although their specific beliefs vary widely, they all challenge the fundamental principles of political equality and the consent of the governed that underpin liberal democracy. They reject the notion that all people are created equal and that no individual or group is naturally entitled to rule over others. Some groups hold that society has degenerated so severely that violence and other extra-legal measures, arson, assault, bombings, murder, theft, can be justified to restore what they see as traditional moral values and racial hierarchies. While their core beliefs are fundamentally anti-democratic, some frame their vigilantism using language borrowed from the Declaration of Independence, invoking the right to revolt against tyrannical governments. The Ku Klux Klan provides a historical through-line for understanding this persistence. The Klan has been most active during 3 key periods: immediately after the Civil War during Reconstruction in the 1920s, 1920-something, and throughout the Civil Rights era of the 1950s and 1960s. Although there were significant differences between these iterations, scholar David Cunningham argues these shouldn't be understood as 3 separate organizations operating under the same name. Strong ties of membership and ritual connected the groups across time, united by their commitment to white supremacist ideology and their goal to maintain or restore traditional racial hierarchies. Certain white supremacist groups today focus on advocating their beliefs, attending meetings or marches with like-minded individuals, and adopting symbols associated with their ideology, rather than taking direct violent action. These activities generally fall under constitutionally protected free speech and expression, which creates a complex challenge for democratic societies trying to balance freedom with safety. But here's what makes this story truly sobering. White supremacy isn't just an American problem or even a Western problem. It's become a global system of power that operates across borders, cultures, and political systems. Remember that 2014 poll of British citizens where 59% felt proud of their colonial legacy? That's not nostalgia. That's an active belief system that continues to shape international relations, economic policies, and cultural exchanges. When half of Britons claim that countries colonized by Britain were better off for it, they're not just expressing historical opinion, they're endorsing a worldview that sees European intervention as inherently beneficial. Through movies and mass media, corporate culture, advertising, multinational manufacturing, military presence, historical colonial relationships, missionary work, and countless other channels, the ideology of white superiority continues to circulate globally. This is particularly powerful in countries that have histories of Western colonialism, where local power structures often still reflect colonial hierarchies. The impact is psychological as much as political. Tunisian author Albert Memmi's observation remains painfully relevant. It is not easy to escape mentally from a concrete situation, to refuse its ideology while continuing to live with its actual relationships. Even when formal colonial relationships end, the mental frameworks they created often persist. This global circulation of white supremacist ideology helps explain phenomena we see worldwide. The popularity of skin-lightening products in Asia and Africa, the preferential treatment of Western tourists and workers in many countries, the continued dominance of European languages and educational systems in former colonies, and the persistent association of development with becoming more like Europe and North America. White supremacy has successfully positioned itself as the default setting of modernity itself. To be modern, successful, and respectable often means adopting European standards of beauty, behavior, governance, and cultural expression. This isn't accidental. It's the result of centuries of systematic ideological conditioning backed by economic and military power. Let's take a breath here and consider what we've uncovered. We've traced a line from 15th century papal decrees to 21st century internet forums, from colonial conquest to modern political campaigns. We've seen how a system that began with the assertion of Christian superiority evolved into a global network of racial hierarchy that operates largely below the level of conscious recognition. This isn't a story about individual hatred, though individual hatred certainly plays a role. This is about systematic power, about how certain ways of organizing society, certain assumptions about human worth, certain distributions of resources and opportunities have become so normalized that they're virtually invisible to those who benefit from them. As we close today's episode, remember Charles W. Mills's warning. White supremacy is the unnamed system shaping the modern world. It hides in plain sight, woven into our economic structures, our politics, and the stories we're taught to accept without question. But here's the twist. Once you name a system, you can challenge it. And the deeper you look, the more unsettling the connections become. What if the forces we think we've outgrown are still steering the present, just in quieter, smarter ways? If you're ready to see how deep this architecture truly goes, download the Scoob app now to unlock the full story. New chapters, deeper context, and extended episodes are all waiting for you inside Scoob.